On this episode, we visit Boston, Massachusetts. We talk with the chief engineer about sidewalks. We learn about WalkBoston and pedestrian advocacy. We drop in on the Liveable Streets Alliance. Finally, we look at the Smoot and the nature of distance. Stay tuned.
We're in Boston, Massachusetts, talking with Katie Cho. What do you do for the city?
I am the Chief Engineer and Director of Construction Management for the Public Works Department.
So, are you in charge of sidewalks then?
I am in charge of sidewalks. I am in charge of all of the construction that takes place in the city's right-of-way, whether it's done by the city or whether it's done by a private entity.
Boston's been here a long time. What are your sidewalks like?
We pride ourselves on being America's walking city, and so our sidewalks are generally in pretty good shape, but we certainly have a lot of work to do as well. So as we've got old infrastructure, and we try desperately to maintain that old infrastructure, but it takes a lot of resources and a lot of funding.
Now, in a lot of places are driven on a complaint basis. Someone complains about a hole in the sidewalk, you go fix it. What's been your experience over the years with that?
So that is how we have been running our sidewalk maintenance program, is really complaint-based. You call into 311 and say there's a problem with my sidewalk, and then we put you on the list to go fix. What we have discovered in doing our analysis of our sidewalk program is that's not actually the best way to be managing our sidewalk maintenance program. It's not as proactive as we really feel it needs to be, and it's too spotty. You can fix a problem that somebody complained about, but there might be one a half mile down the road that the same people are walking over that doesn't get fixed. So we're starting to shift our strategy to think more holistically about how we maintain our sidewalks.
And if you aren't going to just rely on people calling in problems, how do you know where the problems are?
So we still want people to call in problems because that's a great resource for us, but we're also taking a more proactive approach. So we have just completed a major assessment of our entire sidewalk infrastructure. We've got about 1,600 miles of sidewalks in the city of Boston, and we started in 2014 with a walk audit of every single mile of that sidewalk. So we actually sent out teams of engineers to assess our sidewalks and gather all the condition data and ADA compliance data for every one of our sidewalks in the city. And we've been doing analysis for the last couple of years on the information that we collected as part of that effort.
And you crunched the numbers. What did you find?
We found a few things. It confirmed that doing spot repairs was not the most effective way to be spending our capital maintenance money. And the second thing that we found was a little bit more concerning to us than that, and that was that the areas of the city with our lowest income and our highest socially vulnerable populations were the areas that also had the worst sidewalk conditions. And so that really made us think about what we as a city had as values and how we would help the people that needed the help the most.
Is that a common problem when you rely on 311 to report problems and get things fixed?
So it is. What we found as part of the same analysis is that the areas that had the worst conditions were also the areas that were reporting the least amount of problems to 311. And so it did show an equity problem. When you look at our 311 statistics, people complain about the sidewalks that are in the best condition the most. And we get fewer complaints on the sidewalks that are in the worst condition. So 311 is not always a good indicator overall of the conditions of our sidewalks.
So what are you doing moving forward now that you've assembled the data, analyzed the data, determined some equity issues in different parts of the city? What are you doing going forward?
So we are changing our strategy and how we actually make our capital investments. So we are, what we've done is we've mapped out our most important pedestrian connections, because we realize that creating a pedestrian network is very important. People don't just walk to the next house over. They walk to their bus station, they walk to their transit station, they walk to school, they walk to work. to their social center. So they want to get places from where they are, which is typically where they live. And so what we did was an analysis of where people live and where the most important places that they may want to go are, and created a network of sidewalks in the city that connected all of those places, the people to the places where they wanted to go. And we've labeled that our high priority sidewalk network. And that is where we'll be focusing the majority of our capital investments, because it helps the most people get to where they want to be on the sidewalks. The second thing that we've done is really overlaid our sidewalk condition map with our social vulnerability map. And we found the areas where our highest socially vulnerable populations have the worst sidewalk conditions. And we're prioritizing investments in those areas.
And the Boston area has a million little townships and other jurisdictions, many of which border Boston. Do you find you have to interact with your neighboring jurisdictions much when you're dealing with pedestrian and bicycle issues?
Yes, very much so. I mean, jurisdictions don't really matter to people who need to go places. They travel through them all the time, and we want to make sure that we have a contiguous network with our neighbors, and that's very important. So we each have slightly different standards in terms of the materials that we use and the designs that we use, but making sure that those connections are in place is very important.
And does Boston have control over its own roads and sidewalks, or do you have to deal with the state of Massachusetts very much?
We have multiple jurisdictions within the city of Boston in terms of our roads and sidewalks. So while the city owns and controls most of them, we certainly have quite a few state roads that cross the city, local state roads, so not like highways, but local state roads that people are driving and walking on. We also have areas that are private roads, and so we need to work with private homeowners on those roads. And then we also have areas that belong to other city departments, like parks, like our redevelopment authority. So we try and think holistically about what the city is, and then work with those multiple jurisdictions to make sure that we're getting the outcome that we want.
And how do you know when you've reached that outcome that you want? What constitutes success in a business like this?
It's difficult to measure, honestly, and that's something that we're really working on. And so our new sidewalk program, this new way of investing, is actually a finalist for the Bloomberg Mayor's Challenge. And as part of our process with Bloomberg Philanthropies, we're really looking at how do we measure success? What does success mean? And what does it mean to the people who live here? What does it mean to our residents? What does it mean to our commuters? What does it mean to the public at large and the more than 20 million visitors that we have in the city a year? How do we measure that? And how do we make sure that we're continuing to make progress with our improvements to our pedestrian infrastructure?
We're in Boston, Massachusetts, talking with Brendan Carney, who's Communications Director with WalkBoston. What is WalkBoston?
WalkBoston is a pedestrian advocacy organization. We're actually the first advocacy organization in the country, and we're working to make Massachusetts more walkable.
What sort of issues have you been working on lately?
A number of different issues. We've been working on areas where there have been high pedestrian crashes all around the state with Mass DOT, the Department of Transportation. We've also been working on a program called Age-Friendly Boston with the City of Boston to focus on walkability as it applies to seniors, making sure there's plenty of street trees and seating. And we've also been working on Vision Zero with the City of Boston.
What is Vision Zero?
So Vision Zero is the big idea of eliminating all traffic fatalities and serious injuries. Boston has made a commitment, as has the city of Cambridge and Somerville, which is right across the river here, to do that by 2030.
Massachusetts is a big state. Boston, the capital, biggest city. You also have small towns out there. How do their pedestrian issues differ from what you have here in the big city?
That's a good question. So there are 351 cities and towns all across Massachusetts, and they range from Boston, which has about 680,000 residents, to cities like Goshen, Massachusetts, which is 4,000 residents. And some of their big issues are focused on the town centers. They have a high-speed state route that goes through the middle of the town, and they're worried about access across these big major state roads and how they can slow traffic through the town centers to access needed services in the downtown.
So when the state highway becomes your main street, all of a sudden you need to talk with Mass DOT about.
Yeah, you have to talk to Mass DOT about traffic calming on these bigger state roads. So, a lot of that is, can we look at, making sure that we don't necessarily need a complete street. We need a complete street, but we don't necessarily need sidewalks on both sides of Route 9. We need to make sure there's a safe place to walk alongside the one side of it and then have safe crossings to get to other locations. So complete streets can mean very different things in very different places.
What's this bridge behind us?
So this is the Longfellow Bridge. It was first built in 1908, and it was recently renovated. It was about a 5-year process. They just cut the ribbon on it last week at the end of May, and it now has much better facilities for people walking and biking.
What was it like before?
There, even as recently as 2007, 2008, there were sidewalks near the end of both sides of the bridge that were only about 1.5 feet wide. So if you were in a wheelchair or if you were pushing a stroller, it was next to impossible for you to get across the bridge by yourself.
And you say they improved on that in the rebuilt bridge.
Yeah, they now have, on one side it has at least 6 foot wide sidewalks. On the other side it has 10 foot wide sidewalks. Much better. You can actually pass someone going in opposite directions. A crazy idea, I know. But yeah, it's much improved in that regard. And there are now also protected bike lanes on both sides of the bridge as well to make it better for bicyclists as well. Because previously, if you were only creating a safe place for people walking, people biking would also hop up there on the sidewalk because they didn't feel safe themselves. So by creating safe places for both, you're making it better for everybody.
Now, in addition to pedestrians, bicyclists, who else uses the bridge?
So there's also the MBTA's red line goes across the bridge, and there's also car access across this bridge.
And the new bridge is basically the same width as the old bridge. How did they go about the process of deciding how to reallocate the space?
It was actually a long community process that was started probably about 6 years ago, I'd say, before my time at WalkBoston. But there were, a lot of negotiations between Mass DOT, the communities of the communities of Cambridge and Boston, and also a lot of the advocates, including WalkBoston, Liveable Streets Alliance, Boston Cyclists Union, and Mass Bike, pushing for, actually usage by more people than just people in cars.
And we're down next to the river here. What's going on with access to the river?
So another great thing, it's kind of in concert with this project, is they're replacing the pedestrian footbridge that went from Charles Circle over here to the Esplanade, going over Storrow Drive, and it's called the Appleton Footbridge, and it's going to be probably double the width. So previously it was a pretty narrow footbridge coming over to the river. Now it's much wider, ADA compliant. It's going to be a pretty stunning bridge as well. So it should be opening this fall.
Now, what does it take to get a city or the state to make the commitment to pedestrians that they'll replace a badly outdated bridge with one that's twice as wide and meets modern standards?
That's a wonderful question. I think a lot of it has to do with constantly showing up to public meetings, pushing for safer access for pedestrians, but it's also having partners within the state and the cities that are also advocating for that within their own departments. It's not enough for rabble-rousing from the outside, but there's got to be people with the vision that also work in these roles that understand that it makes more sense for everyone to create a more livable city if you make it safer for people walking and biking as well.
What constitutes success? When you get to the end of the year and have your wrap-up of what WalkBoston accomplished over the last year, what do you tell people?
I think a lot of the times it's being able to show the before and after of, what things were before, because sometimes we get lost in the day-to-day of, there is another problem, another fire to put out. But when you kind of take a step back and look at, we used to have 1.5 foot wide sidewalks on the Longfellow Bridge, and you say, like, this is a great project and they did a great job with this. Like, we should be able to celebrate things like that. So sometimes taking a step back and celebrating the progress is very important.
We're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, talking with Andrew McFarland, who's a community engagement manager for Liveable Streets. What is Liveable Streets?
Liveable Streets Alliance, we are a transportation advocacy nonprofit, so we work with communities and cities and towns in the state all around the Boston area to promote and advocate for better walking, biking, transit, making sure that it's easier and safer for people to get around the Boston area.
What does a community engagement manager do?
I work with some of our members, also with external communities, working with our partners to advocate for better buses mostly, but also our Vision Zero initiative, and making sure that people understand what we're advocating for, but also ways they can get involved and participate in our campaigns.
What's going on with better buses? What are the issues you're dealing with there?
Yeah, so I lead our Better Buses campaign, and that's all about trying to improve our bus system. We have about 450,000 people who ride the MBTA bus system every day here in Greater Boston, and they're servicing hundreds of communities. And so we are working mostly with cities like Cambridge and Boston to make sure we're improving our street conditions to prioritize buses and to get people where they're going. There are a lot of inequities within our bus system. According to a report that the MAPC put out last year, black bus riders spend 64 hours more per year on the bus relative to white bus riders in the MBTA system. So trying to improve transit reliability and commute times is really about trying to improve access to opportunity. And we're trying to promote ideas and also opportunities for improving bus service.
Are you making any progress?
Yeah, so this past week we've gotten some really great news. The city of Boston will be committing to a 1 mile long morning peak bus lane on Washington Street in Rosendale. This is one of the biggest bus corridors in New England. 19,000 bus riders are traveling along it every day, and during the morning and evening peak commute, there are something like 60% of the people traveling along that corridor are in a bus. But they also have horrendous delays. There's a lot of congestion along the corridor. So over the last year, we've been working with neighborhood groups and bus riders themselves to connect with them, to let them know what the city of Boston can do to improve street conditions by putting in a bus-only lane, and making sure that the community is advocating for this and working with the city to make it a reality. So we just learned that the city will be committing to making it permanent, and the pilot was going on for the last month, but they're reinstating it next week and making it permanent after that.
Well, congratulations. Now on Vision Zero, how do you approach something like that?
Yeah, so Vision Zero is like a huge kind of wonky policy, but the heart of it is trying to make our streets safer for everybody, and using the data that's more available to planners and city agencies and state agencies to address where our biggest safety concerns are. So one of the things that we've been doing is we've organized a coalition and worked in partnership with groups like WalkBoston and the Cyclist Union, Mass Bike, Safe Rose Alliance, and other groups in the Boston area, and working with them in partnership to promote Vision Zero, to ask cities and towns to adopt Vision Zero as a policy to improve safety on their streets, but also hold them accountable to their action plans and goals, and connecting with our members to report back on their progress. So one of the things that we've been doing the last couple of years is putting out a progress report for the city of Boston to show, how are they meeting their own goals and standards for making our streets safer. And we're also working on doing that in Cambridge too, which just adopted Vision Zero a year and a half ago.
How important are goals and standards to the Vision Zero process?
They're incredibly important. In Boston, the goal is to eliminate traffic fatalities by 2030. So if we're not setting benchmarks for, by 2020, by 2025, we should be at this point if we want to meet our goal by 2030. It's not going to happen. So we see accountability as the real crux of our Vision Zero advocacy. And it's really important to explain to people that this is about making our roads safer for everybody, not just one mode. It's all about safer road conditions for people walking, biking, driving, etc.
Now, what does a path like the one we're standing next to have to do with what you folks are working on?
So another initiative that we lead is something called the Emerald Network. And the Emerald Network is a take on Frederick Law Olmsted's Emerald Necklace, which is across the river in Boston. But the Emerald Network is a vision for 200 miles of seamlessly connected greenways, so biking and walking trails throughout Greater Boston. So we're on one greenway that doesn't really connect to anything else, but the vision is to connect all these greenways together. We're a block away from the Grand Junction, which is a railroad right away, and there's a vision for putting in an active use, multi-use walking and biking trail path along the railroad right away, and that would connect eventually to the community path extension in Somerville down to the Charles River. And so that would be a really great way for people who are biking from suburbs to the northwest of Boston, like Somerville or Arlington or Lexington, and biking down into the city safely. And what we've seen is, greenways are really critical for creating corridors where people can walk and bike and be active in their communities. It's also a really great way to improve our transportation networks and make sure that everyone has access to really great parks and open spaces. So,
what is it about the Boston area that might make it a little challenging to create a network like that?
Some of the challenges are that we have so many different communities and jurisdictions. Right now we're standing in Cambridge. If you go a mile across the river, you'll be in Boston. If you go a mile north, you'll be in Somerville. These are all separate municipalities, so they have their own ways of addressing traffic safety, but also housing, etc. And then there are other state agencies like the Department of Conservation and Recreation, which oversees a lot of the parkways, like Stroll Drive or Memorial Drive. And then there are other state partners like MassDOT, which oversees the entire state transportation system. So and all these communities have really long entrenched histories and ways of doing things. So trying to get them to coordinate on a vision as big as the Emerald Network is sometimes difficult. But what we're seeing increasingly is that it's more and more a priority for these communities. So trying to link up opportunities in neighboring communities is something that we're really interested in doing as a nonprofit. A great example of that is between Cambridge and Watertown, which is a community to the west of Cambridge. They've been working on a lot of great Greenway programs together, so we've been helping them in that effort.
If I were to come back to Cambridge, Boston area, 10 years from now, and drop by your office, what would you like to be able to show me as your accomplishments over that time?
When it comes to our bus system, I would love to see, we have outlined about 5 corridors across the city of Boston that really need to see bus priority improvements, and that means bus lanes, but also transit signal priority, improved access to bus stops and improved bus stop amenities like more bus shelters, safer conditions for people to wait for the bus. I would love to see all 5 of those corridors improved, whether it's Mass Ave in Back Bay in the South End, or Brighton Ave in Alston, Warren Street in Roxbury, Blue Hill Ave, going from Dorchester down to Mattapan, or Washington Street in Rosendale, which we just talked about, and just seeing more equitable access to transit, because our bus system is really critical for getting low-income populations, but also populations that have been historically underserved. Giving them reliable access to transportation will be critical for accessing healthcare, accessing educational opportunities, workforce development opportunities. So I love to see that 64 hours that I mentioned between black bus riders and white bus riders. I love to see that gap narrowed to ideally zero. But it's definitely a hard fight. There are a lot of historical inequities that we have to contend with when we're looking at our transit system.
We're standing next to the Harvard Bridge. It takes Massachusetts Avenue between Cambridge and Boston. The Harvard Bridge is 364.4 smoots long. What's a smoot? It's the height of an MIT student named Smoot. Is that any more arbitrary or less arbitrary than the length of a foot or the length of a meter? Not really. If I told you the Harvard Bridge was 10 minutes long and that you could walk across it in 10 minutes, that might have a little more meaning. Pedestrian wayfinding signs in many parts of the world go with time rather than distance. A half mile, a kilometer, 364 smoots, that can seem like a long distance. A 10-minute walk, that's not so bad.
Visit us on the internet at www.pedestrians.org.